Hello, my name is Charlie Miller, and I'm interviewing Jim Leady. Today's date is February 23rd, 2023. I'd like to start with some biographical information. So could you talk about your date and place of birth?
Sure. I was born in Valparaiso, Indiana, which is about less than an hour from where I live now. And say July 17th, 1969. It was actually, they were on the way to the moon. So they'd taken off on the 16th and landed on the 20th, and my mom delivered me on the way there.
Nice. Can you tell us a little bit about your parents and like their occupations and if they served in the military at all or not?
Sure. My mother was a lot of different times in my life. She was a stay-at-home mom part of the time, but she often had part-time jobs. She worked in like school as a reading assistant or lunch lady when I was young, and then older, she worked in grocery stores. And probably her last 15, 20 years of working, she was a school bus driver. So she did a lot of jobs in the community. My father was a steel worker, and he worked 39 years in U.S. Steel in Gary, Indiana.
Nice. What schooling did you have before entering the military?
Well, just your basic, I went through public schools, K through 12, first through fourth grade. I went to Portage schools in Portage, Indiana, and then we moved to the neighboring town, Chesterton, and that's where I graduated from Chesterton High School. And then upon leaving high school, I joined the military because I went to West Point, and you're on active duty throughout your time at West Point.
And what were your kind of like initial motivations to like do that after high school and not enter like a standard career path?
That is a great question, because I've been thinking about that a lot lately. As I have some students right now who are thinking about careers in the military, and just kind of reflecting back with my daughter on some things. But my older brother, he's 4 years older than me. He had gone to West Point. And prior to that, though, we didn't have really much of a military service history in our family. My grandfather served in the Guard during the Second World War, but he wasn't medically fit for overseas duty. So really, my brother was kind of the path breaker, I guess. And so I was exposed to, what West Point was and what it offered and the advantages and all the pluses there. And then when I was like a senior in high school and I was applying to colleges, that was naturally, I gravitated towards that. There are other schools I considered. And I ended up getting the early admissions or early option. And so I made my decision early. And lots of times in my life, I've gone back and thought, well, what if I had done this? What if I've done that? Certainly my life would have turned out very differently, I think. But I'm very pleased with my life and where I ended up. And you just think about all the dots that have connected to like get you to meet your future, your spouse and your children and all that stuff. I have no regrets about what I've done.
And what were like your parents' initial reactions and your other family members? Were they like surprised, or how'd they feel about it?
No, not surprised. I think pride for my parents mainly. They're very proud of the fact that I went there, my older brother as well. I would have to say there was kind of some expectation or pressure for me to go. Like once I got admitted, they're like, well, why would you go anywhere else? And I think I narrowed my choice set after that. And that's what time to time makes me think, well, what if? But there was a lot of pride from my parents especially.
Cool. Can you tell us a little bit about like where you went to initially enlist or like sign up for West Point?
Well, it's a little bit different than like going to the recruiting station and talking to recruiters. So it was mainly through the mail. I had to interview. You have to get an appointment from your congressman or senator. I actually got an appointment from Congressman Pete Visclosky, who just recently left Congress, and as well as Senator Richard Lugar and Senator Dan Quayle. So I received appointments from all of them and ended up using Richard Lugar's appointment. I got a kind of a neat story with that. If I could flash forward a bit on your question. So if I go to after my third year at West Point, going into my senior year, I spent about a month at the Pentagon doing an internship. I was a economics major, and so I did a 3 or 4 week internship at the Pentagon, looking at policy kind of division there. So I was there. I thought, well, I'd like to thank Senator Lugar for his sponsorship and getting me into West Point. So I called his office, expecting at most a little 30-second photo op. And he invited me over, and then I got to sit one-on-one with Senator Lugar in his office, just me and him for about an hour. We just, shot the breeze and talked, and then he had to go record something for C-SPAN. So I got to go in his, follow him, and we went, through the secret tunnels and Congress and all this stuff. And I got to watch him record his segment, and it was pretty neat. It was something that really always stuck with me.
That's awesome. And I guess once you got that initial enlistment, did you just have to, present it to the West Point academy, and then they'd admit you? Or
well, yeah, so there's kind of 3 hurdles you have to get over to get into West Point. So one is getting the political appointment, one is to get West Point to admit you, and that's probably the hardest one for most people. That's when they're looking at your transcript and your activities, just normal college admissions type stuff. And then you also have to pass a physical exam, and that catches a lot of people, as well as do part of the admissions part. You have to do like a physical training test where you do push-ups and that type of stuff. So I guess it's a different process than like enlisting in the Army or something like that. But once we show up at West Point, once you're there, then you're fully in from day one. And in a sense, you kind of restart when you graduate, because then you get your commission and restart as a commissioned officer.
And when you got to West Point, what was the initial kind of reaction to the new culture? Was it much of a culture shock, or was it?
It was a tremendous culture shock. I even thought I knew a lot would happen, just having my older brother and hearing his stories, but I was no way prepared for what happened. It took me a while, months, to adjust to kind of the civilian mindset and to the military mindset with, formations 3 times a day at, 6 a.m. and lunch and dinner. And really the first year, and especially the first summer, the first 6 or 7 weeks there, it's really designed to stress you out, and you're always busy, and you're always getting yelled at, and you're always doing the wrong thing. And, it's just, you really kind of have to bond with your classmates to pull through. And that's kind of the point of it. But I think I'm going to stray. I forgot what your question was now. I'm starting to ramble, but it took a lot of time to adjust.
Yeah. What was an average day at West Point?
Well, there's kind of 2 average days. So freshman average day when you're a plebe is very different from, say, sophomore through senior year. As a plebe, I was actually on the cross country team, so I'd have to 5:30 practice, or was it 6 a.m. practice? 5:30 practice, I think, in the morning. And then, after practice, we'd have a breakfast formation. By breakfast formation at whatever that was, I don't remember, 6:30 in the morning, you'd have to have, be in uniform, have your shoes shined, and you'd have to know what was happening from the front page of the New York Times. You'd have to have all this trivia memorized, how many days to Christmas, how many days to 100th night, how many days Army, Navy, and so then you'd get kind of quizzed as you're standing in formation. So you do that. That happened 3 times a day: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Then we'd eat together. We sat, we had assigned tables, and you'd sit. And as a freshman, you've got duties where you're in charge of passing out beverages or whatever. And again, that can be a stressful event for a lot of freshmen. Luckily, I was on the cross country team, so I ate with the cross country team, and it was very relaxed. I had a softer experience, people would say, because of that. But then you go to your classes, and that's a lot like normal college, except we're in uniform, and you were never late for class. You never skipped class. You didn't do those things, or if you did, there were consequences. But then once like when we're outside and you're in the area of the dorms, which we call the barracks, or in area of the classrooms, you as a freshman, you weren't allowed to talk, you weren't allowed to stand around. You had to like go from point A to point B and not look around. But once you're an upperclassman, after sophomore year and going up, then it's more like being more like a normal college student. You still had to go to formation, still had to be in uniform, still had room inspections and all that stuff, but you didn't have people in your face all the time. So
That definitely sounds different than my college experience. But
where'd you go to college, Charlie?
I'm applying right now, but I'm not looking.
That's right.
One point, so yeah. What was like the initial I guess training that they would teach you aside from school? Like, what were some of the exercises you would do?
Okay, so West Point's a little bit different. I work at Notre Dame now, and I'm not affiliated with the ROTC program. I actually was an ROTC instructor at the University of Kentucky several years ago. It's pretty different from what like an ROTC student would do. We didn't do much military training throughout the academic year. There are some optional things you could do, but as far as mandatory stuff, very little other than like a physical fitness test. We concentrated our military training in the summer. So after your freshman year, you'd get maybe 3 weeks off to go back home, and then you'd be back all summer doing kind of the basic soldier skills training that you would do at basic training. Some of that we did the summer prior to West Point. So you show up on July 1st before your freshman year, and you do some of those basic training type stuff then. But a lot of the tactics and basic infantryman stuff that you learn as a soldier, you do in between your freshman and sophomore years at a camp called Camp Buckner, which is maybe 10 minutes down the road from West Point. And then junior and senior years, the summers prior to those, you'd do more military training. Either you'd be a leader at the training of the freshmen or sophomores, or you would go out to an Army unit and serve as like kind of a shadow platoon leader. Or what I did is I spent 5 weeks as kind of a drill cadet. So I was kind of like a junior drill sergeant at basic training at Fort Knox.
And I guess so. Aside from the training and I guess the school, did you have any other duties that were tied to the military, or was it mainly you were just at West Point and enrolling in those classes?
Yeah, your focus definitely is your classwork and graduating. Academics is definitely number one. Like I said, your military training was largely concentrated in the summers. You'd have to maintain your physical fitness. You still had to always have military bearings. So we had room inspections weekly, or daily, depending on the situation. And but the main training, happened before, in the summers. And then once you graduate and you're actually going out into the real Army, then you'd go off and get more formal training on how, and basic officer training, depending on what branch of service you're going into.
And I guess, can you talk a little bit now about kind of once you graduated West Point, what was the transition into that initial training?
Right. So that's a pretty exciting time. So it changes a little bit since then, but we'd go off to what we called at the time officer basic course. And you would go into a branch specific course. So either infantry, artillery, I went into engineers. So I joined the Corps of Engineers. So I went to engineer officer basic course, which was at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. It was maybe 4.5 months or so. And then you have, some training on, basic leadership. But most of it was, and some of it's basic, Army skills. That's, how to lead a squad, how to lead a platoon, basic infantry tactics. But most of it was specific towards, your branch. So as engineers, we learned how to put in bridges, how to, put in obstacles, take out obstacles, do demolitions and minefields and things like that.
And after West Point, where did, I guess, you have those initial training sessions at?
Okay, so my initial training that I was just speaking about was in Missouri at Fort Leonard Wood. But also I went to Ranger School after my basic course. And with Ranger School, you start at Fort Benning, Georgia, and then we went to 3 other bases because you do the Benning phase, and you do a swamp phase. Well, then you did a desert phase, and that was at Fort Bliss, Texas. Then we did a mountain phase in Dahlonega, Georgia, and then we did a swamp phase in Eglin Air Force Base in the Panhandle of Florida. So that was Ranger School, and then my next more schooling, I did Airborne School, which is at Fort Benning, Georgia at the time. Then I finally went out to my unit. My first unit was in Hawaii at the Schofield Barracks, Hawaii. And I was a platoon leader with the 65th Engineer Battalion. So that was very exciting and also very daunting, because here I was I 22, I believe, and I'm in charge of about 30, 35 men from age like 19 up to, 38. And I was in charge of them. And most of them have many more years experience than you and know a lot more than you, but yet you're in charge. And so, it was a quick learning curve, but that was probably my favorite time in the Army, as my platoon leader time.
And what was happening at a macro level with the U.S. kind of geopolitical thing? Were we deployed, I assume, Iraq, Afghanistan at that point? Yeah,
so here's what was going on. My class, when we graduated, I was actually at that internship I did at the Pentagon before my senior year. I was at the Pentagon when Saddam Hussein and Iraq invaded Kuwait, and things spun up. So by the time it was during my senior year, especially during the spring of my senior year, when the Iraq War happened, the first Iraq War, Desert Storm. So I missed out on that. That was wrapped up by the time I graduated from West Point. And then, but also what was happening was the Cold War had ended. And while I was a senior, like all of my classmates, there's roughly 1,000 of us at West Point, knew our duty assignments, maybe in March of senior year. And a third of our class was going to Germany, because a third of our Army was in Germany at the time. Like 1 million soldiers were in Germany or something like that. And then when the wall came down just prior to that, about a year prior to that. And so, the US decided to pull back out of Germany. And so all my classmates, a lot of them had their assignments change, and they drew, the Army was quickly shrinking. So during my time as a platoon leader, as an officer at the 65th, normally as out of West Point, you have an 8-year total commitment to serve, with 5 of those on active duty. And because the Army was shrinking in size by roughly half, something like that, we actually had early exit points from our active duty obligation. You could have gotten out at like 3 years and 5 years. So the geopolitical situation in the world did have a big impact. I ended up serving on active duty a little over 4 years instead of 5 because of that. The Army was shrinking down. And so I transitioned into the Army Reserve, about a year earlier than I otherwise would have.
Can you talk a little bit more? I thought this was super interesting. When you were in control on those young men in Hawaii, would you go at, I guess, a learning or instruction situation with kind of a hard attitude, or would you, I guess, treat them, like your friends? And
neither one of those. I certainly didn't treat them like my friends, although I was friendly with them, but I didn't treat them like my friends, right? So not my peers. Now, it depends too, like the more senior sergeants. So I had a platoon sergeant who was the senior enlisted member, and then 3 squad leaders. Now, I got to be pretty close with most of them because that's who I spent most of my time with. Now, did I have them overall for, at my house for a cookout? Yes. But did I go out partying with them? No, that didn't happen. So, but I was fortunate in that I had a platoon sergeant who was kind of old and grizzled, and kind of took me under his wing. And, really a platoon sergeant's job is to train the young platoon leader to be a leader. And so I was fortunate to have a great platoon sergeant. His name was Saipan Teo. He originally from American Samoa. And he taught me a lot. So I think the way I went into it, I think I was a very successful platoon leader in my opinion, but was I was open to, I didn't act like I know how to do everything and we're going to do it my way. I took input from my leaders, my enlisted leaders especially, and then, maybe changed their plans or, adapted. But, and then as I became more experienced and over time, they started coming, with certain things, they'd come to me, and, hey, how do you think we should do this? And, so it changed over time as well. So
I guess we're talking a lot about West Point, but I'd just be curious, was West Point perceived by the people, I guess, in your battalion, the battalion's the right word, the 32 that you're overseeing, as a good thing, or was that threatening to them, or was there any color around kind of the pedigree that you came in with?
From my platoon in general, the enlisted people in general, most of them had a pretty good high respect for West Point. Some of them might have had a run-in with a West Point officer in their past, and just had some guy who ended up not being very, maybe just a jerk with them or something. So there's always this kind of perception that West Point officers could be conceited or something like that, stuck up. But that was a minority of people had that attitude, and wasn't very common. So I didn't see it as, and a lot of people would just do the opposite. That it earned you instant respect from a lot of people. So.
And what were I guess the assignments that you were doing in Hawaii with these group and women?
So, like I said, I spent my first almost 2 years as a platoon leader. I was 22 months as a platoon leader, which was wonderful. It's unusual to be a platoon leader that long. You get to be a platoon leader for 12 months. You're lucky. Some people never get to be a platoon leader as a lieutenant, and that's the best job. What we did was, as a platoon, my platoon supported an infantry battalion. So an infantry battalion so the 25th Infantry, who we were part of division, was light. That was actually their name, 25th Infantry Division Light, which means they had no heavy equipment, no tracked vehicles. They went everywhere basically on foot. And so they were smaller than a normal division in number of people. But my platoon, normally in a mechanized or armored division, of an engineer platoon would only support a company which is maybe 100 infantry. We supported a whole battalion. So we would go out on their exercises. We would, when they're assaulting an objective, we were responsible for taking out the obstacles that would be in their way. When they're in the defensive, we're responsible for putting in the obstacles to keep the enemy from approaching. That was probably the main job there. But we did a couple of missions. 2 neat missions I got to do as a platoon leader were disaster relief. One was when Hurricane Iniki rolled through Hawaii. It was in 1992. It glanced off Oahu, which is where Honolulu is, the most populous island, and it hit Kauai very hard. And my platoon was in a ready status, because there was always one platoon equipment loaded up, ready to fly to war in 8 hours notice. My platoon was the next one. So our equipment wasn't loaded up, ready to go to war, but we were the next in line. So we were all set to go. And so we actually got to go to Kauai on a U.S. Marine Corps aircraft carrier, which was really cool. We loaded up all our equipment down at Pearl Harbor. And I still remember today, we're on the deck of the aircraft carrier sailing out of Pearl Harbor in the sunset, and they had Lee Greenwood playing on the radio, on the speakers, and it was quite a moment. But what we did there is we have chainsaws as engineers, and so we just did chainsaw work for about 3 or 4 weeks, cleaning up the roads and getting them passable. So that was one neat experience I got. Another one was we got to go to. I took maybe 2/3 of my platoon to the Philippines. They have a kind of a training a training and support exercise there every year, or back then they did. But again, it was as a natural disaster relief effort. So Mount Pinatubo had erupted earlier that year, wiped out our Air Force base and part of our Navy base, but more importantly, it wiped out a lot of habitable area for Filipinos. And so what we were sent to do is they had created a new village for displaced Filipinos. And we went in to build a concrete pad for them so they'd have a place to dry rice and do things like that. So I got to go on a little recon trip. And then about a month later, we took most of my platoon, and we were there for about 3 weeks building a concrete pad. And it was a trip because we had no equipment. We had a concrete mixer. That was it. And everything else we did by hand. Like normally you have heavy equipment and you compact, you bring the rollers in and you compact the soil. We concocted kind of like pogo sticks, but like heavy wood pads, like maybe 6 inches of wood, and put 2 handles on them. We jump up and down like kind of like a pogo stick with no spring, but just jump up and down to kind of compact the soil. So it was crazy, but it was a lot of fun and get to experience the different culture and all that. So, and the troops just loved it. So,
yeah. Do you now want to transition a little bit into like after that initial few years into like your first deployment?
Yeah. So, I spent the rest of my time in Hawaii doing some other jobs as a lieutenant. I was a company XO, and then I became the battalion personnel officer, adjutant personnel officer. And then when my time in Hawaii was up, I decided, as I mentioned, to leave active duty, and I went to graduate school, moving to Michigan to go to the University of Michigan. But I stayed on in the reserve, the Army Reserve. So when I got to Michigan, I was in, I transitioned from combat unit to a support unit, which was quite a change in pace for me. And then I was in, these support units for several years in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Southfield, Michigan, Grand Rapids, Michigan. I commanded a water supply company. That was pretty unique because the company didn't exist. It was brand new. And so I had like 2 people when I was assigned to it as the commander. And by the time I left, we had like about 100 people. And, we had no equipment except like a desk. And that was it when we got there. And by the time, we had, $10 million worth of equipment. So got to build up a quartermaster company from scratch. That was a big challenge. Then let's see. So then when I left Ann Arbor, I moved to Kentucky for my first teaching job as a civilian. And this is when I transitioned to my reserve job as a ROTC instructor supporting the University of Kentucky. And while I was doing that job, I got notified that I would be going to Iraq. So my unit wasn't going. Another unit had gone, but they had someone get injured and they needed a major who was a quartermaster, a logistician. And so that I fit the bill, and I found out I was going to Iraq. So that was 2005. And that was something, so.
Did you have kids at that point?
I did. And I'll say, when they say support military families, the deployment was much harder on my wife than it was on me, but by far, because we were far away from family. She had some good friends in the neighborhood, but all her family was, up in Michigan, basically. And it was my first deployment in 2005 and my second deployment in 2015 were like night and day different as far as connecting with the family. When I left in 2005, I'd call on a landline phone. I'd have to go wait at the phone tent for sometimes no line, sometimes 20-minute line. And then I'd have to call through all kinds of 1-800 numbers to try to get through. And I'd get through and I'd talk for 10 or 15 minutes. And then someone else is waiting behind you. So you'd get off the phone and do that every other day, maybe. And when I went in 2015, got FaceTime on my phone. I had Wi-Fi in my little my little hut where I lived, and so I could talk to them, face to face all the time. So it's very different.
What were your assignments in Iraq like?
Yeah. So what was stressful for me is was going to Iraq because I didn't know what I was going into. Because again, I wasn't part of the unit, and all I knew was going to backfill. And I'd finally gotten a hold of someone in Iraq, and they said, "Oh, we're going to send you down to Numanaya, and you'll be in charge of the base." So the unit I was assigned to was responsible for, it was a large unit. General Petraeus was the 3-star commander of it, and he went on to other things later on. But we were responsible for training, equipping, recruiting, training, and equipping the Iraqi army, the Iraqi Navy, the Iraqi police force, the security forces, the special forces. That was our job. Our job wasn't really to fight, it was to train, equip, and train. And so I was on the equip part of that. I worked on, so my units ran the little Iraqi bases as far as, food and clothing and vehicles and maintenance and all that type of stuff. So I thought originally I was going to a small Iraqi base to kind of be in charge of the logistics at the space. But it turned out when I got there, they sent me to Balad, which is what's called LSA, Logistical Support Area Anaconda, which is in Balad, Iraq. And this is our major footprint in Iraq. It's a base. It's maybe 5 miles square on a side. It has like 20,000 U.S. Servicemen and women, and about another 10,000 U.S. contractors. So it's huge and relatively safe. Being in Iraq, it was relatively safe. I was fortunate that I never had to be in direct combat or get in firefights and things like that. So my job was kind of odd. It was a unique job. I was a liaison officer between my organization, which was called, it's hard to get it right, it's MNSTICI, Multinational Security Transition Command, Iraq. It's a lot of letters. So I was a liaison officer between this unit and the 1st Theater Support Command, which at the time was called the 1st Corps Support Command, 1st COSCOM, which was basically running logistics in Iraq for U.S. forces. So I was kind of a link between my unit, which is trying to do logistics for Iraqi forces, support the Iraqi forces in their logistics, and the unit that did logistics for the U.S. forces. So I had all kinds of odd tasks, like someone ordered, $2 million of flak vests for our Iraqi army, and they got lost in transit. So I'd have to drive around the base and try to find, $2 million worth of missing flak vests, and there's so much logistics came through. There's this giant yard with just lost stuff, like size of a football field filled up with lost cargo. So that'd be like an example, but I really was most involved with transportation. At some point, it became a higher priority to train and equip the Iraqi units. And so the generals way above me worked out a deal where the U.S. transportation units, U.S. Army truck drivers, would support my missions, which was to move Iraqi equipment that's destined for Iraqi units, but on U.S. trucks. Most of it went on civilian trucks. Our unit would negotiate with Iraqi trucking companies and ship it. But that there wasn't enough of that, because this is when the roadside bombs were kicking in and ramping up, and it was, and so what I would do is I'd coordinate to get Iraqi equipment ultimately destined for Iraqi units shipped on U.S. Trucks on convoys. So that was mainly what I did most of that deployment.
And what was it like, I guess, working with the Iraqis? Did you find a lot of similarities between your military, the United States military, and their military, or was it very different? No,
there's very few similarities. And I'll say, with the caveat that I didn't work very closely with the Iraqis on a normal basis. A couple of times I would, have an Iraqi convoy would show up, and they weren't allowed on our base, but sometimes we'd have to. But kind of the mindset was just very different. One Iraqi general had ordered for the Iraqi army a whole bunch of ammunition. I think it was coming from Hungary or one of the Balkan countries. I forget which country, but I think one of the Balkan countries. So this ship arrived at the Qasr, which is the port, the only port really in Iraq. And it has, probably hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars worth of ammunition on it. And there was no planning about what to do when the ship arrived, right? So there was no security plan, no storage plan, no transportation plan, just a ship with a bunch of ammunition, which you can imagine is a lot of concern just kind of that was a senior officer for the Iraqi army lacking all kinds of knowledge and skills on how things should run. And I compare that to when I've worked with a lot of generals. I sat in lots of meetings where I brief generals or I work with generals. Our generals are sharp people. I have never met a dumb general. Almost all of our colonels are sharp people. So it's just the contrast in the training and the mentality was tremendous.
Yeah. I mean, I can see how that, can be frustrating. What was, I guess, on that base, kind of transitioning from like the work aspects, what were some of your favorite things to do in like your free time?
Okay. We had like little gyms. I went to the one that was, I got lucky again. Not only was I on kind of the base, but, it's a big air base, so this is where, fighter jets and cargo planes would fly in and out of. And I got put in the Air Force housing area, which from an Army guy, the Air Force guys always have better housing, better quality of life. So that was kind of nice. We had a nice little gym, a tent, a giant tent that was an air-conditioned gym. Air conditioning is a euphemism, but so I'd work out. I'd watch movies on my laptop or something like that. And then I had a bunch of friends, and we just kind of hang out and watch a TV show or a movie or something together.
Yeah, pretty standard stuff. How long were you stationed at the Iraq base for?
It was about 7 months. Again, it wasn't like the full year because I backfilled somebody. And so like the unit was there for about a year, but since I came late, I was only there for about 7 months, which turned out to be a problem for me because at the time, if you had spent a full year on the ground, you were kind of safe from getting sent back to Iraq for another year, like you were guaranteed like a year home. But since I only had 7 months on ground, I was eligible to go the next day, after I got back. So that actually contributed to my decision at that time to get out of the Army. And I left the service for a number of years.
And then you said you had a second deployment in 2015. So how did you decide, like, I want to re-enter the military and go serve again?
Right. To what your mother was asking about earlier, the deployment was really hard on my wife. We had my daughter was 2 and my son was 5 or 6 when I deployed. And so when I got back, and I was also looking for a job, I was at a visiting professorship job, and I don't think the employers were too keen on knowing I was in the reserve and could be deployed again. So I ended up getting a good job before I left the service. But I left the service for about 7 years. But about 6 years in, I decided to get back in once kind of my kids got older and my job situation stabilized and all that. So I got back into service in 2014. And within 3 months, I got notice that I was deploying to Kuwait. They're like, welcome back, you're going. And again, it wasn't, my unit wasn't deploying. I was transferred to another unit. But this time was very different experience because my reserve unit at the time was, when I got back in, was a transportation battalion here in South Bend. And I was transferred to a small 11-person unit in Evansville, Indiana. The 690th Quartermaster Detachment is what it was called. It was just a detachment. It was so tiny. We were called a petroleum liaison team. And so ultimately it was nice because I got to I got assigned to the unit about 6 months before we deployed. So I got to go through all the training up with them, got to know them really well. And then we deployed like in May of 2015 after, maybe, several months of train up and 2 months almost, full time, at an Army base training. So this time we went to Camp Arif John, Kuwait, is where we were mostly stationed out of. But as a team, we supported the whole Middle East. Our 11 people supported the whole Middle East. So we had 2 of our team were in Afghanistan. The rest of us were based out of Camp Arif John, but a good chunk of us, not a good chunk of our team, went up to Iraq regularly or different bases. And our role was to really kind of be the eyes and the ears on the ground for the Defense Logistics Agency energy team. So Defense Logistics Agency, DLA, energy provides fuel for all the services everywhere in the world. So you're talking, fuel for the Humvees, fuel for jets, fuel for cargo planes, fuel for ships. This is what the Defense Logistics Agency does. And so we were the kind of their eyes and ears on the ground, forward in theater. And a lot of what we did was quality assurance and quality surveillance for petroleum, making sure all the fuel issue points all throughout, they're in Iraq, they're in Kuwait, they're in Afghanistan, different places. Their fuel is testing up to quality, their equipment's up to quality. And so we were kind of quality assurance for that. That was kind of the stated mission of our little detachment, but we integrated with the 1st Theater Support Command, which is the kind of logistics headquarters that worked with the CENTCOM, which Central Command, U.S. Central Command, which has oversight over all the Middle East. And so I worked closely with kind of the general staff in their logistics team. And I didn't do as much of the quality assurance, going out to bases and checking on their fuel and stuff. I didn't do much of that. I was more the logistics planner and planned how much fuel we needed. Different bases were standing up, and because in Iraq, I went to Iraq in response to was Operation Inherent Resolve. I had to look it up to fill out the form today. Inherent Resolve, and also Enduring Freedom was Afghanistan. But so the Inherent Resolve was a response to Islamic State overrunning much of Iraq and Syria. And so we had already closed down most of the bases in Iraq. We had left Iraq, and now we're re-standing up bases and putting in new bases, new air bases. And so my job was, how much fuel are we going to need based on the amount of equipment we're there? How are we going to get the fuel there? How are we going to keep the fuel there? Which was really challenging because with the Iraqi militias that were backed by the Iranians, we had contract for fuel to be delivered from an Iraqi, petroleum base on Iraqi trucks to get to the Iraqi base, or to our U.S. base. But the militia were taking out the convoys. And so we ended up having to refuel most of these bases, or some of these bases anyway, by air, which was really challenging logistically. So it was a great experience in that, I got to be involved in, supporting the troops that were forward. Got to learn a lot about, I know a lot about petroleum. I didn't know much prior to going into it. But it was also, just, seeing the whole team come together and get to see all different parts of logistics work towards supporting the warfighters.
It's really interesting to talk to you because we haven't had a chance to see many people who've seen different parts of, I guess, the 2 decades that we were kind of in the region. So it's interesting to hear your perspective kind of in the, I say, early 2000s, because very different, I'd say, probably macro issues driving what's happening in the region as well.
Very different, right? Yeah, when I got to Iraq in 2005, we'd been there for a couple of years and things were heating up. Things had already gotten kind of bad. The roadside bombs were happening, but it got even worse after I left, right? So it was, it was still fairly stable in a lot of parts. There were parts that were unstable, but a lot of parts were still pretty stable. But back in 2015 now, it depended. If you're up in the north, like in Erbil area where the Kurds, the Iraqi Kurds, that area was relatively calm, relatively safe. But then different areas were just impassable on road. The only way to get there was by air. And so it was challenging, building up bases that, we had shut down US bases. Now we got to build it up from scratch. And so there's a lot logistically, that's very challenging.
How long were you stationed in Kuwait for?
9 months. Yeah, by this time, kind of the Army at least had figured out that 9 months was about the right time for most people. And so we were there almost like 9 months to the day. And so the full deployment, the full activation time was close to a year, because we were training up for a couple months before we went, and then you're about a week or two on the tail end, you kind of wind things down. But yeah, 9 months on the boots on ground, we say.
And then after that 9 months, did you come back to the United States and remain in the reserves, or did you just end your service?
No, at this point, I did remain in the reserves. So back in 2014, when I got back in the reserves, I did so because, I had 15 years of service. And if you get 20 years of service, you can qualify for retirement. And so, I thought that would be a nice achievement. And so when I got back from Kuwait, still had about 3.5, 4 years to go to get to the 20-year point. So that was my goal. Yeah.
And I guess one question you can talk about, both like coming back from your deployment in 2005 and as well as 2015, how easy was it to adjust to the civilian life coming back from, I guess, such like a strict daily schedule overseas?
I'll tell you, I had zero problem adjusting because, again, I wasn't in the high, like what you see in the movies. I wasn't in any of those situations. I didn't have, I had a few kind of mildly scary things, but nothing really were like, oh crap, I'm not going to make it. Or so I didn't have, it was very different for me. It wasn't like watching The Hurt Locker or any of that stuff. That wasn't my experience at all. I was very fortunate. I guess one thing that is different, and this is true anytime you go away from home for a long time, is when you're away from home, life's almost simpler. All you have to do is take care of you. Go to do your job, and then when you're off your job, it's just you. You make a video call and you talk to your family, but then all the rest of the time is yours. And then when you get back, it's like, as a parent, you don't have none of the time it's yours. So a little bit of adjustment, but that was a happy and a good adjustment. So.
Yeah, that's good. For the, I guess, last 10 years, you said you've been working at Notre Dame, correct?
Yeah, actually 17 years now.
Oh, wow. And are you still involved in veterans organizations at the university?
Yeah, to a degree. There's a veterans kind of alumni group that we meet every once in a while. I support I don't work directly with the ROTC because you got to be in the reserve and be assigned to that or whatever. But I work with them from time to time. We have an Office of Military and Veterans Affairs on campus, and I support a lot of their programs. For instance, my wife Michelle and I serve as host family for 3 ROTC cadets. So we have them over a couple times a year for dinner or cookouts or whatever. We here at Notre Dame, we have a program that we support. It's a national program called Warrior Scholar Project, where they take people who are in the service, who are actively serving, and are either transitioning or about to transition to the civilian world and going to go back to college or go to college for the first time, really. And so there's a program that kind of provides training and college experience for them for about 2 weeks on campuses across the country. And so Notre Dame participates. And so for the last couple of years, I've kind of set up the business training end of that, our business school's involvement with that, as well as, taught, a little intro class. So I maintain contact, but it's it's kind of just stuff that I enjoy doing rather than like a formal commitment.
Have either of your kids expressed interest in serving?
No, they haven't, and I really haven't pushed it either. If they would have wanted to, I would have supported them. The closest they came as my daughter went to actually an Air Force summer camp before her senior year for engineering, sponsored by the Society of American Military Engineers. So she got to go to Scott Air Force Base in the St. Louis area, actually in Illinois, in the St. Louis area. And she got to kind of live, in an Air Force tent for a week and do kind of engineering stuff. But she really did it more from the engineering aspect because she actually is now a civil engineering major, rather than more to find out about engineering than to find out about the military, I would say.
Cool. Well, we're well over our 30-minute mark. So if there's anything else you want to talk about, feel free, but that's all the questions I have.
Were there stories we should have asked you about or things that you'd like to kind of add to the record? Favorite moments or anything that we maybe didn't get to?
I'll tell you maybe two things. One is going back to our early discussion about West Point. My friends, the men and women I became friends with my company, we're still really close today. I missed out on seeing them last summer. We had like a mini reunion, and we're hoping to do it again this summer. So I'm really looking forward to that. But we still stay in touch, and that's important to me. We were kind of fortunate in that we were one of the few classes at West Point who all 4 years we were together. Usually the classes before us and after us, most of the classes would spend a year or two with one group and then scramble and then be assigned to a different unit for the rest of their time. And so we stuck all 4 years together. And so we're pretty close. So I do enjoy that. And then I'll tell a kind of a cute story. So one of the things I do with my current students is I do music trivia, like for transitioning between topics or after a quiz, just to kind of lighten the load. And currently I play a Coldplay song, but I do an a cappella cover of it by a group called Naturally Seven. So if you haven't seen this, go on YouTube and do Naturally Seven Fix You, the song Fix You by Coldplay. And so they do the song, it's a cappella, and so, but then they start integrating photos of servicemen and women returning from overseas deployments. And it gets me every time I watch it. And especially one scene, where it's the little girl, I'm almost getting emotional just talking about it now. So, that still gets me every time, because I remember when I was deployed, being so anxious to get back and so excited to get back to my family. So look, I can't even talk about it. I'm not even watching the video. So watch the video. I think you'll enjoy it.
So Naturally Seven, Fix You by Coldplay.
Right.
Okay, I'm writing it down. We will. We definitely will. Well, I think more than anything, we would just love to thank you for your service. 20 years is an incredible gift to give this country. And you've given it to so many universities too. I can only imagine the number of students that you've taught. Obviously, people in the battalions that you worked with, and all the lives that were touched. So we really want to thank you for not only your time today, but your service to our country.
Well, thank you very much. And it's always a little awkward when people thank you for your service, I think. I understand it, and I thank people for their service too. But on the receiving end of it, it's just something I felt like I should do. I felt it was my duty. And honestly, when the 2015 deployment, I remember my commander called me one night and said, "Hey, Jim, there's a short list of officer names. They need one major to go to Iraq, and there's 20 names on the list, and you're one of them. Is there any reason you can't go?" And I think of the 20 people, I was the only one who didn't come up with a reason not to go. I told them, I said, "I don't want to go, but my back's fine. I can't pretend my back hurt. I can't give you a reason I can't go. Do I hope you pick somebody else? And I said, sure, but if you need me to go, I'm going to go. And that's kind of been my attitude, all along. So it's been a privilege to serve, and I've enjoyed it too. And I've enjoyed
Well, it seems like you got to work with amazing generals, as you mentioned, but also had some great mentors along the way, which I'm sure had to have really shaped, that attitude. And sounds like you really were surrounded by people from the very beginning that were incredible.
Yeah, all through. I probably should throw out a few names. So if this is getting recorded for posterity, please. Captain Berriman was my initial company commander. He was fabulous. Rick Berriman. In the reserve, I had Rod Falk, who was a co-captain at the time, became a major, and then he ended up becoming a general. He was a big mentor. Colonel Colo, just a lot of people. But the largest, I would say, is Sergeant First Class Saipan Teo was the guy who trained me from being a green lieutenant to a seasoned officer, I'd say. So,
do you know where he is today?
The last time I saw him is when I had gone back to Fort Leonard Wood for a further captain's career course training, and by that time he had retired, and he was working there as a civilian. So I imagine that was a long time ago. That was over 20 years ago when I saw him last. So I think he's still in Missouri, but maybe this will motivate me to reach out to him.